All right, welcome back for part two of chapter two. This time we'll be taking a look at the settlement of New England. And by the time this is all done, you should be able to make a good comparison between those who settled in New England as opposed to those who had settled in the Chesapeake. As we take a look at this New England group of settlers, we'll be taking a look at what is probably one of the most storied group of settlers ever to venture to the New World, the legendary Pilgrims. And we'll also compare them against the Puritans as well. These Puritans will be legendary for their religious zeal, as they had tried to purify the Church of England while staying within the church, as opposed to the Pilgrims, who had become separatists and had grown tired of the Catholic remnants of the Anglican Church, and they were looking to separate themselves from the Anglican Church. Now, in 1608, the Pilgrims left Scrooby Manor, which is just north of London, during the rule of King James I. And as they were a separatist group looking to leave the church, they fled to Holland. And there, after settling and mixing, albeit too much, they felt that they were losing their heritage and culture and customs, and that their Dutch hosts had almost been too welcoming. And so in 1620, they had agreed to set sail for America, hoping to have landed in Virginia in what had been granted to them. However, due to navigational errors, they actually landed in New England. And it was there at Plymouth where the Pilgrims finally set anchor, but not before signing the historical Mayflower Compact. Because whereas nearly half of the sailors who had been on board had died along the trip, the remaining had agreed to kind of combine themselves together for the good of the whole. And whereas this isn't exactly a constitution, it is at least an agreement to abide by majority rule. And this will eventually lead to adult male settlers meeting in assemblies to make laws in town meetings. However, as time goes on, due to the difficulties, the Pilgrims' plantation never really grows in numbers, and eventually it will be absorbed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And leadership of the Pilgrims fell to a man named William Bradford, who you can imagine how surprised he as well as the others were when they disembarked off the boat and were welcomed by a Native American named Squanto, who had been taken back to Europe and taught English and eventually had escaped back over to America and greets them in nearly perfect English. And as we know from the story of the first Thanksgiving, if it weren't for the natives teaching the new settlers new hunting and fishing and farming techniques, that these settlers probably would have vanished because of the tough life. However, once in the New World, they did try to replicate what they were used to back in England into their new settlements. And unlike their Chesapeake brethren, these New Englanders will eventually be moving over as families and in communities, and with a more of a structured support system, something that we'll take a look at later on as well. Now, as we turn our attention to the other group of settlers during this time period, the Puritans, we take a look at their continued feud between members of Parliament and King James I and King Charles I. And whereas the Puritans had become concerned with the monarchy's lack of concern for the spiritual health of the nation, upset with the corruption in government, they had continued to look for ways to try to purify the church from within, trying to get rid of other Catholic ideals and parts of the service that they didn't want to see in the Anglican Church. And because of these differences, eventually King Charles decides to disband Parliament in 1629. And eventually, as the Puritans are kind of the spark for the English Civil War and the battles that ensue, eventually by 1649 they actually capture and execute the king himself. As Calvinists, the Puritans believed in the idea of predestination. And this was the idea that God had determined those who would be saved and be destined for eternal salvation, and those who were not. And there's nothing that they could do to kind of influence whether or not they were to be saved. However, it was a belief of the Puritans, kind of, that they work like hell to try to prove that they were not destined to go to hell. But they also believed in thrift, frugality, and kind of had this communal feeling. And John Winthrop will be their leader who kind of helps bring them over in what becomes known as the Great Migration to settle in the Massachusetts Bay region. And the Puritans had believed that they had formed a special covenant with God and that he had granted them all this land and would provide for them if they lived good moral lives and be, as they believed, a beacon of righteousness for others. And as they said, to be a city upon a hill for others to look up to and emulate. And once these Puritans had settled in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they found an environment that was much more hospitable than what had existed in the Chesapeake region. And being the fact that they came over in nuclear families, there was a much more balanced ratio of men to women. They had families and support of one another. They discovered the cleaner water, the healthier climate, all of which led to healthier living conditions, and the belief that they, as they settled in these villages, that they would work for the common purpose. And in fact, this kind of impacted life in other ways as well, in that by 1631, men who had owned land and had belonged to the church would be considered freemen and would be eligible to vote in for the many different offices and jobs that were elected positions. In fact, during this time, it was believed that roughly 40% of the males could vote, which actually was quite high for the time, even though it's not something that we would consider high during like Jacksonian era of democracy or even today's standards. And this map kind of gives you an idea of what a typical village settlement might look like, where you've got your houses kind of located near the road, and in the back of each house was the field that the family would tend to while supporting each other. And being that all the houses were kind of grouped together and the fields were exposed, the church elders and other people of town could kind of make sure that each of their neighbors was doing their part to ensure the success and vitality of the community. And whereas families were an integral part of each of these villages, so was the church. In fact, the Puritans had established congregational churches where each village church was ran without outside interference, and those that could vote would elect the officials to lead the church. However, even non-members of the church were required to attend church each day, as it was a very integral part of the society. And to kind of show the social structure that had developed, people really had kind of a place in society. And the more prominent member of each community that you were, the closer to the front you would sit. And so this was a very well structured, kind of deeply ingrained very religious communities that were developed. And not surprisingly, as we see the continued increase in the white population in New England, we do witness the decline of Native Americans, which is very similar to that of the Chesapeake region as well. But one slight difference that you may notice is that the black population, although present, doesn't take the sharp increase that we'll see in the Chesapeake. And by this next map and chart, what you can see is that New Englanders would tend to live not only longer than their Chesapeake brothers, but also longer than those back in England, as a testimony to the healthy living conditions. And in fact, it is sometimes said that the New Englanders invented grandparents because, for the most part, people in other parts of the world didn't live long enough to see their grandkids. And yet in New England, because you might live to be 65, 70 years old, the chances were really good that you would see your grandkids. These settlers of Massachusetts Bay also attempted to create this stability of kind of conformity and the belief in rule of law. And in 1648, they wrote what becomes known as Laws and Liberties, which is the first alphabetized code of laws printed in English in colonial America. And eventually, what we see are that if you spoke out against the government or the church or kind of went against the norms of society, that many times you'd be banished, and quite often to Rhode Island. And two examples would be Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson. As you can see, Williams was an extreme separatist looking to purify the Anglican Church even more, believing that there were still too many Catholic remnants in it. And he also criticized the village leaders for stealing the land from the natives. Whereas you can see Hutchinson believed that the colonies had lost touch with the scriptures and that the spirit can live without moral laws and that everyone can speak directly to God. This went against the teachings and the belief of what was known as antinomianism, which, as you can see, is Latin for anti-law. Now, because of these outspoken critics, as I said, both of them are eventually banished to Rhode Island. And with that, you can see Rhode Island next to Plymouth and South Massachusetts Bay Colony there. So by 1650, this is kind of the map that's beginning to develop in New England, and of which we'll take a closer look at in future chapters.